My name is Barry Glassner. I'm the Executive Vice Provost here, and I see way too many VIPs, important people, distinguished guests to acknowledge. But I do want to thank the Dean of the Annenberg School, Jeff Cowan, who's at the back here, whose auditorium this is. Applause is good. And I also want to encourage everyone when you leave to please pick up one of these surveys so that we can get some feedback from you from this event and for future events in our planning. And also at the reception you will find the brochure for the complete series. If you don't already have one, we have about 80 events this year. Isn't that right, all told? And we guarantee them to be all spectacular. None will be short of spectacular. There are some seats in here, many seats available. Don't be shy. Please come on up, and people raise their hands if you have seats beside you. Over here too, please come down, take seats. And with that, I don't want to take any more time. We have a very exciting and full program tonight, and I'd like to introduce Professor Michael Parks, who is the director of the School of Journalism. For those of you who don't know him, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer and editor who will be our moderator tonight. Thanks.
Thanks very much, and again, welcome. It's really an exciting event, and one of Provost Nakia's major initiatives. My job is to introduce Casey Cole and get out of the way. Casey will introduce the rest of her co-conspirators in this conversation. Casey is a science journalist who's here as a visiting professor of science journalism. She was a science writer for more than a decade at the Los Angeles Times and has written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, Discover magazine, and a variety of other things. She's written 7 nonfiction books. I first really encountered Casey when I was told she wanted a book leave. I was, I think, managing editor of the Los Angeles Times. Someone came in and said, Casey Cole wants a book leave. And I said, oh, well, better let her come in. So I said, Casey, what's the book about? She said, nothing. I regard this as a quintessential Casey Cole moment. She was going to write a book on the meaning of nothing. Now, this is why I need to get out of here, because I'd begin to steal lines from Casey and probably from Cliff Johnson and everybody else who's going to be speaking tonight. We're delighted to begin this initiative here at Annenberg, and I am now going to get out of the way. Casey?
Well, welcome everyone. My goodness, I'm amazed. I hope you understand that we have no idea what's going to happen tonight. We're very excited to have you here as part of this experiment, which is called Science, Serendipity, and the Search for Truth. It grows out of another program we've been doing at Santa Monica Airport, actually, a series of a building that has 30 artist studios in it. And I'm very grateful to SC for letting us to bring it here and let students participate. And I'm especially thankful for Clifford Johnson, my colleague, who I will be introducing in more detail later, whose idea actually it was to make this a part of SC in the Annenberg School. Now, these events are meant to be playful, and by playful I mean that not like team sports playful. I mean play in the sense of trying whatever the heck you like and not being afraid of falling on your face. So for that reason, we do not rehearse. We do not know what each other are saying. We just put people together around different subjects and watch to see what happens. We are, as I say, entirely uncertain of the outcome. I hope the evening will be entertaining and illuminating, but I cannot guarantee that. I am sure of two things. One is that there will be refreshments upstairs afterward, and most importantly, a chance to continue this conversation. There will also be a chance to continue it on Clifford's blog, which I will give you more information about later. The second thing I'm certain of is that you will be getting index cards, and if you don't have a pen or pencil, either ask somebody or they will be available. Those are for questions, so we don't necessarily need to interrupt the flow from subject to subject to subject, and we will all come up at the end, and we will all take questions. I really want you to pass them to the ends of the aisles at the end of each segment. Okay, on to the program. The first pair of programs will focus, as you no doubt know, it'd be hard to miss, on the subject of uncertainty. And we're going to be exploring a lot of facets to that. Tonight we have journalism, physics, religion, theater, humor, music. In our next performance on uncertainty, we have musical composition, we have global warming and journalism, and we also have engineering, which I think is going to be kind of fun, because most people think that engineers don't deal with uncertainty, but boy, do they. In this first segment, we're going to be dealing with uncertainty in a very specific way, and that is an uncertainty as it comes across in terms of quantum theory. Quantum theory simply is a set of phenomena, behavior that describe what goes on in a very, very small realm of atoms or subatomic particles, even smaller. It's very weird and bizarre behavior. But then I have to stop myself when I say that, because actually it's no more weird than the fact that right now there are people on the other side of the earth who are dangling upside down, and they think that that direction is down and that direction is up. So there are a lot of things we get used to that don't make any sense, that take place on different scales than we do. It doesn't make any sense that thin air can hold up a 500,000-pound airplane, or for that matter, a 500,000-pound cloud. But it happens, or that this podium is mostly empty space. So when we talk about making sense, you have to be careful. The beauty of the scientific method and of mathematics is it allows us to go beyond the limitations of our senses and what we like to call common sense. That said, what I'm going to talk to you about briefly, and then we'll have a conversation with a real physicist about uncertainty, but I'm going to tell you what uncertainty looked like to me as someone who had no background whatsoever in physics at all. I didn't know anything about science, and I really didn't like it either. All my exposure in school had been pretty negative. But I had been involved in journalism, and a lot of the things I really liked about it had to do with the fact that they really illuminated and gave me a lot of insights into what I was doing. Actually, at the time, I was writing about foreign affairs, humor, travel, bugs, Easter bonnets, everything, women's issues, you name it, but certainly not science. So I'm just going to give you a very few basics based on my non-physicist perspective, and mention then some very obvious, the most obvious connections with journalism, which we'll talk more about later. The part of quantum theory I'm going to talk about is Werner Heisenberg's notorious uncertainty principle. Why is it called the uncertainty principle? How many people have heard of the uncertainty principle? Oh, well, then I don't have to say anything at all. There are many ways to think about this. I want to caution that they are all metaphors. I was looking for a quote I like to use from Niels Bohr, the founder of quantum theory, but I couldn't find it. But it goes something like, when it comes to atoms, words can be used only as in poetry. We're more concerned with creating images than actually conveying information. So these are metaphors that are all approximate. But here's one that might convey some idea of the uncertainty problem. Let's say there's a butterfly that's flying from this side of the stage to the other side of the stage. And I want to measure how fast it's going. I want to measure its velocity. Well, that's easy. I could simply time when it's at this wall, and then again time when it's at that wall. I know the distance and I know the time, so getting its velocity is really easy. But I have no information at all about what its position is. On the other hand, I could reach up and grab the butterfly in flight, very gently, of course. Then I would have exact notions about its position, but none at all about its velocity. Of course, in our world, I could also take a photograph of the butterfly, and then I wouldn't have to disturb it at all. But in the quantum world of very small things, that doesn't apply. And something as seemingly ephemeral and insubstantial as a light particle can, in fact, be a big disturbance on the system. This duality between being able to know one property of something and not being able to know another is not just about measurement. I want to make that very clear. It's an inherent part of a dualism that pervades all of nature as we know it. We have lots of mutually exclusive kinds of knowledge that don't fit but are both true. Again, quoting Niels Bohr, the opposite of a shallow truth is false. The opposite of a deep truth is also true. An example of that is the fact that light is both waves and particles. If you conduct an experiment to ask light, are you a wave? It will say, yes, I'm a wave. And if you conduct another kind of experiment that asks if it's a particle, it will say, yes. It's a little bit like another very rough metaphor. Think of a spinning coin, which is both heads and tails. It's got both properties, but it's only when you actually pin it down that you get either heads or tails. And at that point, you actually lose sight of the other side of it. So I'm going to give you one further metaphor about uncertainty before I go on to journalism. I actually timed this a little bit with my students, so I had to cut out some, and we will cover that. Whatever is left, we will cover with Clifford. I think it's important to think about just for a second, how can it be that an elementary particle can be a wave? Maybe it's a little bit simpler to think of how light waves, which obviously have wave-like behaviors in many, many ways. That's why we have colors and soap bubbles. But maybe it's easy to imagine how that could be a particle, but to imagine an actual particle as a wave is more difficult. So I'm going to give you the following analogy, which I'm going to come back to in terms of journalism. Say you're at the multiplex and you have an infinite number of elevators going up to an infinite number of different movies. And there's a really high probability that you're going to go see, say, well, in this crowd, let's say Scoop. That would be the obvious movie. And let's say there's a very low probability that you're going to go see How to Eat Fried Worms, and maybe a kind of a medium probability that you're going to go see Little Miss Sunshine. If you were to plot out those probabilities, you would get something that looked very much like a wave. But the minute you get on an escalator and you go to the movie, it's gone. And now you have something that's very discrete and particle-like. So what does all this have to do with journalism? For one thing, the method of questioning has to be transparent, or your story is not going to make any sense, and it won't convey any kind of real truth to the reader. What kind of questions did you ask? What were your sources? This information is rarely conveyed in stories that purport to be journalism, which really bothers me, and not only in science, where it's an unforgivable sin not to say how you know what you know and how you got the information. The bottom line is that any fact or truth really has no value unless you say how you asked the question. This doesn't mean, however, that there's no such thing as objective reality. For those of you who are following the brouhaha over James Fry and his phony memoir, you may have noticed that a lot of very distinguished journalists actually said flat out that there was no such thing as objective reality. This is not true. Reality is complicated, but it's there, and as a journalist, it's not our job to shy away from difficult things. We have to deal with that. Second, the reality of the situation before you decide to report it, never mind how you decide to report it, it's very much like the situation before you got on an escalator. It's multifaceted. There are many different ways you can go. One of the reasons that we see that journalism is often so homogeneous, and that you read basically the same stories in all different sources, whether they're broadcast or whether they're print, is that all the reporters are talking to the same people and they're all looking at the same facts, and they do not take the other escalators, or I don't even think a lot of time they're aware of their existence. And that's one of the reasons you get so often the case, and again, not only in science reporting, where the reporters will report A one day, and then half a year later or a week later, it will be something else entirely. It's because they were only looking at one source. And I actually got into journalism for this reason, because I saw this happening in Eastern Europe, where I was living in Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, neither of which exist anymore, but oh well. That what I saw going on in the street just bore no relation to what I was reading in the newspapers, because people were just listening to the State Department and official sources, and they weren't out on the street. So, fourth, the opposite of a deep truth is not heresy. Waves and particles are mutually exclusive properties of light, but both are true. And the worst tendency we have in journalism is to write stories as if they were only one way of looking at them. The final thing I'm going to say is that the solution to this problem is not balance. And this is really important, because while it's true that a subatomic entity like a particle can have both wave and particle aspects, depending on the context in which you're looking at it, it can be entirely a particle or entirely a wave. And one example of how that works in journalism, that people mistake this, is the stories about evolution and intelligent design. Evolution and intelligent design are both concepts that have a certain validity in culture and history and other contexts, but in the context of science, evolution is science and intelligent design is not. And there should never be an attempt to balance the two in this kind of story. So now I'm going to invite Clifford Johnson to join me. We're going to sit on the chairs, and we're going to talk about uncertainty and physics and journalism. Among other things, Clifford is one of the top theoretical physicists in the country, dealing in a subject called string theory, you may have heard of. Deals with multidimensional spaces and fundamental particles that look more like strings and particles. But much more generally, it's about the fundamental forces and the way the universe is constructed in space and time and matter, and all the fundamental questions. In addition to that, he's a prolific and entertaining blogger, gardener, cook, artist, and a lot of other things. After this program is over, Clifford is going to blog this event on his new blog, which is called Asymptotia, ASYMPTOTIA.com. You are invited to come on, join, ask questions, and continue the conversation. So, Clifford, let's go. Hi.
Hello.
Is there anything you'd like to say before I begin?
Well, welcome everyone, and let's have some fun. What I thought I would do first, actually, is just warm everything up with a film clip. So what I'll actually do is tell you a little bit about it. So it's from the film The Man Who Wasn't There. It's one of the Coen brothers films, one of my favorites. And I really love the film for several reasons, but it's particularly great. In the middle of the film, all of a sudden, there's a little speech about the uncertainty principle, so it's great, and I thought we could see it. So just let you know what it's about, so get the setting right. It's somewhat soon after World War II. It's set in a small town in America. It's around 1947 or something. And so some of the language and etc. are, you must take that in context. There's a murder. A man's wife is accused of the murder. They've got the best lawyer they can possibly afford from out of town. Big lawyer comes down from Sacramento, and they have no idea what he's doing. And this speech doesn't help. He comes in and he gives this dramatic speech about the uncertainty principle, and I think they're even more worried than they were before. So maybe the clip can come up now. Maybe get out of the way.
Shall we?
They got this guy in Germany, Fritz something or other. Or is it? Maybe it's Werner. Anyway, he's got this theory. You want to test something, scientifically. How the planets go around the sun, what sunspots are made of, why the water comes out of the tap. Well, you got to look at it. But sometimes you look at it, your looking changes it. You can't know the reality of what happened or what would have happened if you hadn't have stuck in your own goddamn schnoz. So there is no what happened. Looking at something changes it. We call it the uncertainty principle. Sure, it sounds screwy, but even Einstein says the guy's onto something. Science, perception, reality, doubt, reasonable doubt. I'm saying sometimes the more you look, the less you really know. It's a fact, a proved fact. In a way, it's the only fact there is. This Heine even wrote it out in numbers. Burns?
So that's what Clifford does. He writes his stuff out in numbers. And one of the questions I actually want to ask you is, to what extent is it legitimate to take these metaphors from physics and apply them to realms like journalism or other fields? Do you think that's worthwhile? We all know where it's happened in things like What the Bleep Do We Know, where people have taken quantum physics into a different direction. So can you talk about when it works and when it doesn't, and when it's useful and when it isn't?
Well, I actually think it's legitimate. There's a flow of metaphors and ideas from not just physics, but science in general, into the rest of life. And the flow actually runs both ways, and I think it's actually very powerful, very useful, and often informs the one or the other. So there is value, but one has to be careful. I think you referred to the What the Bleep stuff. For those of you who don't know what that is, there's a movie out there that purports to be more of a documentary than complete fiction, which it actually is. And it tries to relate some of the things we're familiar with on the atomic scale, from quantum mechanics, etc., things perhaps being apparently in more than one place at the same time, etc. It tries to relate that to things that are happening in real life, and uses as an explanation for everything from the spirit world to telepathy and things like that. And it has no basis in fact. It's conjecture. It's a little bit of fun, which is well, I think of it as a little bit of fun, but those people are really deceiving people who don't know science, and it's unfortunate. So I should say that. So that's when they're actually trying to say that the science is addressing a realm which it has no business talking about, and there's a precise reason for that. So I should say a couple of things, actually, which relate to this. First of all, the uncertainty principle is really something, it's saying something very fundamental about how we perceive space and time. It comes, a lot of the times you'll hear, such as in the movie clip, which I have to say is fun, but it's overstating things a little bit. It's often stated that the uncertainty principle is due to the fact that you're disturbing something when you're looking at it, etc. And you can arrive to a lot of the properties of the uncertainty principle that way, but it's actually a lot deeper than that. It really is saying fundamentally there's something about space and time which on the big scales we think are one way, which is that we can arbitrarily specify information. We can know arbitrarily well the properties, say, of a particle at a particular point and its position and its momentum, as Casey was talking about. So that's very true in the real world, the big world, as it were. But actually, when you get down to the scales of where quantum mechanics is relevant, you find that space and time really aren't like that. They're fundamentally different, and that's what the uncertainty principle is saying. You can know very accurately the momentum of the particle, but then you don't know very well its position, or vice versa. These things come in pairs. And what happens when we get to these big scales is that it becomes approximately true that you can know these things. And the point is that nature has given us a constant that we had not known about before the 20th century, called Planck's constant, after Planck, who first realized it's important. And it's a very, very small number. It's in appropriate units, it's something like 10 to the minus 34 joule seconds of the unit. So it means it really will only be relevant when things are very small down at those scales that it's talking about. And it's really just irrelevant at these large scales. There's a better way of saying it in terms of quantum decoherence, etc.,
Right.
but we don't have time for that.
Can I ask you, though, without going into that, can you talk about where and how the transition takes place? I mean, I'm assuming it's not a sharp line where you go from the quantum world into the everyday world. So is that an unfair question?
It would take a long time to go into the details because it really depends. You can actually prepare systems very, very carefully and make that quantumness survive to larger scales than you may have guessed. But the problem is, the issue is that there's the environment, there's everything else that's interacting with the system you're studying. And everything else is doing lots of things, a huge amount of things. You look at just a few particles, and you count up the number of things they could possibly do, and it's a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And so they're interacting with the system as well when you get to interaction with the environment. And it washes out all of that quantumness very quickly. So it's very hard to do it. In fact, there are people who are working on this problem in the context of trying to develop things like quantum computers. And it's a fundamental problem. You can design a quantum computer to do all these amazing calculations. You have to protect it from the environment, otherwise the quantumness goes away.
I should say that the best explanation I think I heard about this was in Murray Gell-Mann's book, The Quark and the Jaguar, and otherwise not fantastic book, but that part of it was good. Actually, I should also point out that there are everyday systems in which you can see these quantum effects, very special ones, like superconductors. And I was watching the marching band out here practicing, and everybody was all lined up just so. And I thought, well, that's what it is, where you can actually see everything behave in the same way. But let me ask you, as a physicist, when you first encountered these strange effects or unfamiliar effects, do you remember that? And do you think about how strange it is? Or, you know, a lot of people talk about philosophical implications of this. Do you ever?
Well, I think I went through the same thoughts that the students who are learning this thing still go through. I think everyone goes through this. And you think the thoughts are terribly original, but people have been having them since 1925, I guess. And that you begin to worry about what is reality really, and things like that. So endless numbers of conversations between undergraduates sitting discussing whether the moon really exists when you don't look at it, and all of those very important issues. And so yeah, everyone wrestles with it for a while. And to be honest, I think it's because it's so counterintuitive from what happens in the everyday world of macroscopic objects. It's not clear that it sits well with anyone. I think we just accept that there's a set of rules, and they're very well-defined rules. It's not that everything's gone crazy. There's some very well-defined rules to compute very precise things in the physics. But the rules do not work according to the rules that you would use when you're throwing something across the room. So you just get used to the rules and say that's the way nature is, and we've just been fooled by being very big creatures. If we were creatures that were made of stuff that was only not made of stuff, if we were creatures that were of the size of atomic scales, we would have grown up with the intuition about how quantum mechanics works. And then this world, this large world, would seem really weird to us. Yeah. We would, you know, how come you can tell what that thing's doing when I throw it across the room? That's weird. So it's just, we happen to be in this realm, and then we have to get used to this other realm.
Can you, in your everyday work, I know that involves a lot of different things, but in particular when you're dealing with things like string theory and the most fundamental ingredients of nature, is there...
Maybe
that it's uncertain. It's true. But you deal with it as though... Does the uncertainty principle, or can you explain how it might come into play, whether it's in terms of dualities, say, or in some other respect?
So the uncertainty principle is all over fundamental physics, and it's a standard thing that we all use and are familiar with. But I can point maybe at one area. String theory is one aspect of it which is very important, is the fact that it somehow manages to combine quantum mechanics and gravity. And so one of the things Einstein taught us in 1915 is that gravity is really just the ability of space and time to change its shape, to get warped. You may have heard that in Star Trek or things like that. So warping of space-time is a real thing that actually happens. And I always like to mention at this point that you use it every time you fly in an airline, on an airliner. Pilots use general relativity to guide flights. If you have a GPS system in your car, you're using what they use. That uses general relativity. That warping of space-time is really real. And so we know it happens. It's a real thing. And then we know this other lesson about quantum mechanics, about space-time, is this quantum mechanics thing. And so quantum mechanics introduces this uncertainty, this ability of things to perhaps do things that we hadn't expected they would do from classical physics. And string theory combines the two. So one of the things we expect is that when we get the right description, we will see space and time doing uncertain things at a very small scale, perhaps at the very earliest time of the universe's creation.
Well, that is very creepy. That's actually probably a really good time to switch to religion. So please, then that's what we do here. We just switch from one to another. We hope you see commonalities and have a little bit of fun. Please write your questions on your index cards and pass them down. If you need more index cards, we'll do this. And then I'm going to introduce our next guest. And I just have to do this because the titles of some of Jonathan's books are long. Jonathan Kirsch is the most prolific person I know. He's a publishing lawyer. He's written, he's the one who really got me interested in the history of religion. I like to say that Jonathan does for religion what I try to do for physics, which is to make it interesting and accessible. He's the author of Kirsch's Handbook of Publishing Law and Kirsch's Guide to the Book Contract, among others. But in addition to that, he's the author of six books on the history of religion, including The Harlot by the Side of the Road, biographies of Moses and David. The newest book, which we'll tell you a little bit about at the end, about an upcoming event, is A History of the End of the World. And it's just been given a starred review in Booklist, so we'll have that out there for you to sign. But the book that has most to do with uncertainty that Jonathan is going to talk about is called God Against the Gods, and it's a history of the war between polytheism and monotheism. Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, I'm very excited to be here, very honored to be on the USC campus, and it's really a tribute to this program that's such a great turnout. I'm going to be talking about a very different subject, but I think I'm going to make the argument to you that it's not quite so different from what you've already heard. I'm going to be talking about the religious imagination and a kind of theological uncertainty principle. This may seem counterintuitive to you because if you spent any time in Sunday school or Bible study, you think that religion teaches certainty. Religion teaches absolute truth. And frankly, that's the problem with religion. And we're going to wrestle with that problem a little bit. I want to start by explaining or framing what I'm going to be sharing with you in terms of some vocabulary. There's a wonderful book by Bruce Chatwin called The Songlines. It's about his travels in Australia, and he shares the tradition of the Aboriginal people of Australia that the world was sung into existence by ancestor gods, a lizard god, a snake god, a bird god, and they walked through the void and sang, and as they sang, the world came into existence. And so they believe in their religious tradition that a gifted person, a shaman, can look at the landscape of Australia and discern a song line where the ancestor god walked. And Chatwin makes the point that the state railway sends survey teams out with shaman to discern where those song lines are so they don't run a railroad across them. No one else can see them, but the shaman can see them. Now, cultural anthropologists would look at that material and call it an origin myth. And that's kind of a condescending term. We look at our Bible and we say it's Holy Writ. What I'm going to ask you to do is entertain the idea for the next few minutes that the Bible is our origin myth. And it's no more true or less true, and it's no more worthy of respect or reverence than the song lines. And if you can hold that remarkable thought in your mind, what I'm going to be talking about might make a little more sense and might shock you a little less. I also want to say that we've talked or we've heard spoken about the subject of science, and science is the religion of our time. We believe in our heart of hearts that what a man or woman who practices science does is search for a demonstrable, provable truth. And if it can't be proven by experiment, then it's not true. That's the true belief of science. 20 centuries ago, and for many centuries thereafter, religion had precisely the same hold on the human imagination. Thankfully, in my view, that grip has loosened, although it has not loosened universally, and we'll touch on that point as well. We remarkably live in a time where people lose their lives because of the true belief of people who are willing to murder them for holding the wrong belief. That was, by the way, as we're coming up on the 5th anniversary, that was the lesson of 9/11. You can cast it in terms of the clash of civilization, but bear in mind that the men who piloted those planes into those buildings recited as they pushed down on those sticks, God is great, God is great, Allahu Akbar. They were convinced that God had empowered them to kill people for the sin and the crime of holding a false belief. That's what was at the core of 9/11. And I'm going to argue to you in the next few minutes that that's one of the core values of the religious traditions, not only of Islam, but of Judaism and Christianity as well. What is the core value of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition? We are taught to believe that up until Abraham, a man who is revered in all three of these religions, we have so many differences. We look on each other as being so different from one another in our beliefs and our values, and yet, among the many ironies, Abraham is a revered prophet in Judaism and Christianity and Islam alike. And our myth, our religious myth, is that Abraham was the first man to recognize that the religious beliefs and practices of everybody else in the world for all of history until that moment the idea that there were, simple idea to state, there were many gods and goddesses, hundreds of them, thousands of them, millions of them, countless numbers of gods and goddesses with different powers and different personalities, playing different roles in our lives. That belief system was false. The scales fell from Abraham's eyes, and he saw that the real truth was that there was one God. And all the other gods and goddesses were false. They were illusions. This is in our scripture. This is in our religious credos. In Judaism, we say, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. And Paul, the original Jew for Jesus, says, For though there be gods many and lords many, but to us there is one God. And in Islam, the credo is, there is no God but Allah, which strictly speaking should be translated as, there is no God but God. Now, that's the core value, or a core theological value of monotheism. And let's compare it with its opposite, the core value of polytheism, many-godism, or what we condescendingly call paganism. Now, paganism is a term that no pagan ever used, but we're taught to use it. And we think of paganism as something pretty bad, sort of crude and violent and superstitious. Paganism, or polytheism, held this simple idea, which I've already articulated to you, that it's presumptuous of human beings to hold the idea that there's only one God, because in fact, manifestly, there are many different kinds of people. They come in two sexes. They have different personalities. They have different skills. And why shouldn't the divine realm be the same? Why shouldn't there be specialist gods? And why shouldn't they come in pairs? And why shouldn't they fall in love and have sex and have children and fall out of love and be jealous of each other? And of course, that's the religious imagination of polytheism or paganism. And let me pause here and point out the core value of monotheism, that's Judaism and Christianity and Islam, is that there's one God, one truth, one right way, and by implication, if you don't get it and you don't do it, you're guilty of a mistake, of an error, of a sin, of a crime. And the logical extension of that reasoning is, if you're guilty of a crime, you deserve to be punished. And our religious texts are full of people being punished with death for holding the wrong idea. Among the many, many, many terms that monotheism has given to the world is the word heresy. And Casey used that word earlier in her remarks. I've stolen many lines from Casey, including one that I quote in my new book. Heresy is an idea that was totally alien and unknown and really incomprehensible to the pagan world. There was no idea of heresy in a world where you could pick and choose your gods and goddesses, mix them and match them, worship one or the other, any combination, or none at all. What was heresy in a world like that? The core value of monotheism is that you do not have that freedom to mix and match. When you indulge in mix and matching, you indulge in sin under the label heresy. Does anybody know what the Greek root of the word heresy means? Anyone? It means choice. Now we think, most of us, many of us, think that the freedom to choose is a good thing, not a bad thing. Now, that's a loaded word nowadays, isn't it? Freedom to choose. But most of the time, in most contexts, we are pro-choice, right? You pick the clothes you want to wear, you pick the school you want to go to, you pick the job you want to work at, you pick the spouse you would like to wed, and in our great democracy, you pick the God you want to worship and the way you want to worship that God, or you choose not to worship at all. That's choice. In the value system of monotheism, that's not choice, that's heresy. And that's precisely the point of conflict between polytheism and monotheism. Polytheism is liberal, it's open-minded, it's respectful, it's accepting and embracing of difference. And monotheism at its core is not. Paul says, you cannot drink from the cup of the Lord and the cup of the devils. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have it both ways. Now, many of us in this community, in this world, celebrate and embrace that freedom to choose. You know, my wife and I once took a Buddhist meditation class. We're Jewish. We're practicing Jews. That makes us Boo-Jews. That's okay in my value system to be a Boo-Jew. Paul says you cannot drink from the cup of the Lord and the cup of the devils. Jeremiah refers to the one true God. John, the evangelist John, refers to the only true God. Jeremiah says every other idea about God, all those intriguing and beguiling gods and goddesses of the pagan tradition, are what he calls lo elim, no gods. They're nullities, they're illusions. Paul faithfully takes that one step further. They're not no gods, they're devils and demons. And in fact, the early Christians believed that all of those revered gods that we know so well, Jupiter and Apollo and Diana and all of the famous gods of Bullfinch's mythology, are not just iconic figures of classical civilization, but they're actually demons sent into the world by Satan to cloud the minds of men and women to the truth, that one true God. This point is made in a very telling and interesting way in the book of Acts, where the missionary travels of Paul are described. He travels throughout the classical world trying to win converts for the one true God. And when he's in Athens, the seat of paganism, and let me pause here and say, by the way, when we say paganism, at least at that time and place, the time when monotheism enters the Roman world and seeks to win converts to the idea of monotheism, what is paganism? Paganism is the high classical civilization of ancient Greece and Rome. It is what we today still regard with admiration as the benchmark of human achievement. We still talk about classical architecture and classical literature and classical philosophy. That's pagan architecture. It's pagan literature. It's pagan philosophy. And when Paul is wandering through the marketplace in Athens, he's looking on all the altars, and of course these inspire only horror in his eyes. And he comes upon one altar that's inscribed, "To the unknown God." And this prompts him to deliver one of his famous punishing sermons. He excoriates these benighted and ignorant pagans. He says, look how foolish you are. You are unwittingly, unknowingly, blindly worshiping the one true God. But you're so ignorant that you don't even know his name. So you worship him as the unknown God. And then he announces that he's there to set them straight and to reveal the identity of the one true God. Now, archaeology confirms that, in fact, there were altars inscribed with a phrase very similar to the one that Paul uses. In that sense, he's historically correct, although it is never in the singular. None of these inscriptions is to the unknown God. They are to the unknown gods in the plural. And the reason was that those pagans were so respectful, also I have to concede, so fearful of the power of the many gods and goddesses, that they were consumed with fear that they would inadvertently leave out one of the most important, perhaps out of their own ignorance. In fact, the Roman Empire was not a kind and gentle institution. These people were pretty brutal. They conquered all of the known world at that time. They enslaved whole nations. They punished people cruelly. That's one thing you learn from the Passion of the Christ, is that the Romans were darn good torturers. The Romans were good torturers. But they did not punish people for their religious beliefs. If we have time later, I'll explain why the idea of the Christian persecution, which is a part of our religious history, may be a little bit a different story than we're taught to believe it was. As a general rule, the Romans did not persecute people for their religious choices. In fact, the opposite is true. They collected the gods and goddesses of the people they conquered and embraced them and worshiped them, such that a Roman emperor of the early Christian era had a private chapel in his palace where there were altars and images of the gods of the Roman pantheon and the Greek pantheon, and Isis, the Egyptian goddess, and Mithra, a Persian god, and the mother of the gods from Phrygia, and an altar to Abraham, an altar to Yahweh, and an altar to Jesus, because they were equal opportunity worshipers. What was the purpose of the altar inscribed to the unknown gods? It was what one of the sources, I quote in my book, calls an evidence of the pagan notion of spiritual overinsurance. A prayer addressed to the unknown gods was a prayer addressed to whom it may concern. And they wanted to make sure they covered all their bases. It's exactly at that place that you can see what an open-minded religious imagination the pagan world had. There was a pagan prefect of the 4th century named Symmachus, and he said, tell me if this sounds familiar to you, tell me if this sounds like a democratic value to you. What does it matter by which wisdom each of us arrives at the truth? It is not possible that only one road leads to so sublime a mystery. There are many roads to that truth. But against that idea stood the militant and ultimately triumphant early Christian church, which said, no, that's a false idea. That's a heresy. Bishop Fulgentius, also in the 6th century, said of this you can be certain and convinced beyond all doubt, not only pagans, but also all Jews, all heretics, and all schismatics will go into the everlasting fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. Now that's the core value of monotheism. The irony is that this theological uncertainty principle that I have argued to you is the core value of paganism, in fact, permeates monotheism as well. And if you read your Bible with open eyes, you'll see it in plain sight. The theological uncertainty principle, the wave-particle duality, is right in our Scripture. We may say, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one, but in fact there are many different personalities and characteristics attributed to God in the Hebrew Bible. In the story of creation, our creation myth, God doesn't sing the world into existence, but at one point he kind of thinks it into existence. Let there be light. He's just kind of conjuring it up in his imagination, and there was light. And that in one version of the creation story, by the way, if you read your Bible carefully, there are two. In one version, he thinks human beings into existence. And then flash forward a few pages later in your Bible, God is kind of an old man, a sculptor. He hunkers down into the muck of creation. He takes mud into his hands. Isn't that interesting? God has hands. In the first version, God was all mind. God was a vapor. But now God has hands. And he molds that clay into the first man, into Adam. And what does he do? Do you know? Not yet. He gets there. He breathes into this clay man. He breathes in the breath of life. So God has lips and God has the lungs. And that's two different kinds of God. There's a passage in the book of Kings about the prophet Elijah, who so hungers to see God. I mean, God is so hard to get to see in the Hebrew Bible. He prays to God that God should reveal himself. And there's a very sublimely beautiful story told about how God places him in a cleft in a mountain, and he says, I will pass by you as you're in this little gully in the mountain, and a storm passes by, but God, we're told, is not in the storm, and there's great fire, and God is not in the fire, and there's thunder, God is not in the thunder. There's an earthquake, God is not in the earthquake. And the Bible author tells us, and then a still small voice is heard. What is that? That's the stirring of your conscience. That's as much of God as you're going to get. Because in the Jewish tradition, God is incorporeal. He has no human form. But if you flip back a few pages, this is a repetition of a story that's told about Moses. Moses, too, wants to see God. And here you hit that theological uncertainty principle, that wave-particle duality. At one point, we're told, God says, man may not look on my face and live. You'll die if you look at me. And it says a few passages later that Moses spoke to God face to face, as a man speaks to a friend. Now, how do you make sense out of that? Well, that story also has an episode where Moses begs God to show himself in his full form, and God agrees to pass in front of Moses. The Elijah story is actually a repetition of this story. But in the Moses version of the story, God says, you will see me in my full form, but I'm only going to allow you to see me from the backside. Now, this is an unsettling notion for a reverent person. God has a backside. And that's the side that Moses got to see. Now, this idea of theological uncertainty passes forward into the Christian tradition to the great embarrassment of the early Christians. I'm going to bring my talk to an end on this point. When the Christian church came to power in Rome, you know the story. It was a persecuted cult. It was marginalized. It did suffer legal disabilities. Suddenly, Constantine has a conversion experience of some kind, and he makes Christianity a favored religion, and suddenly Christians are not out of power, they're in power. And Christians have access to the courts and the constabulary and the public torturer and the public executioner. And who do they use these tools, these weapons against? Well, they use them against other Christians who are holding the wrong ideas, those old heresies about Christianity. Apparently, there's one true God and one right way to worship him, but even within Christianity, there were some mistakes being made. One of those heresies was the so-called Arian heresy, which was based on a debate about whether God the Father and God the Son, God and Jesus, were of the same stuff or of different stuff. Homoiousian in Greek, or homoousian. Now bear in mind, this was a huge problem for Christians debating with pagans who said, why do you call yourselves monotheists? Aren't you tritheists? Don't you worship a trinity of gods? And the Christians had to say, well, no, you're just getting all that wrong. The Trinity is a mystery, but it's the mystery of one God. But there was, in fact, a debate within the Christian church about whether Jesus was of the same stuff as God or whether he was of different stuff than God. And this was sometimes expressed in the phrase or the word begotten or unbegotten. If he was unbegotten, he was of the same stuff as God. If he was begotten, he was of a different stuff. And the ancient historians record that this became a hot topic of debate among Christians. If you ask a shopkeeper for change, he will argue with you about whether the Son is begotten or unbegotten. If you inquire about the quality of bread, the baker will answer, the Father is greater, the Son is less. And if you ask the bath attendant to draw your water, he will tell you that the Son was created ex nihilo, out of nothing. These were the debates of the Arian heresy. I want to close with the notion that although these can be amusing and diverting and even intellectually stimulating ideas, they have a very dark side. And the Arian heresy led to the torture and execution of thousands. More Christians died under Christian authority in Rome than in all the 10 great persecutions, and we know how many other Jews and Muslims died under similar horrible circumstances. And so what I would leave you with is the notion that these are ideas that we can debate, but there's a terrible, terrible danger in making the wrong choice. Thank you for allowing me to share these thoughts with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really recommend strongly Jonathan's books. They're as entertaining as he is. And I also wanted to mention that on September 24th, when we will be doing a program back at the hangar at Santa Monica Art Studios, we'll have Jonathan again on the theme of the apocalypse, along with Carolyn C., who has a new novel on this theme, and a wonderful astrophysicist from Caltech who will be talking about various apocalyptic scenarios on Earth and in the universe. Now I would like to go to an entirely different realm, the arts, and introduce Chloe Webb, whom I did not know, but who was introduced to me by a mutual friend, who told me to go and see her film, Sid and Nancy, which is about the punk rocker Sid Vicious and his girlfriend, Nancy, who was played by Chloe. So when Chloe actually showed up at one of our events and introduced herself, I couldn't believe it, because I thought she was going to be this drug-addled, barely functioning. Oh, but Chloe has been in, I asked her if I should mention any more movies, and she said, well, there were at least 30. She's also all over television, including House and 2.5 Men and Medium and a gazillion others. So I'm going to let Chloe take over and introduce the rest of her ensemble.
Hi. Could I have a word stand? No, a music stand. Yeah. I have a lot. Hi. I brought the Bohemian contingent. And I'm here as an actor, and our job is to turn words into human emotion. And that's a word and an emotion seems as different as a wave and a particle. And I feel, and I think that I'm lucky that I didn't know the true nature of what I was getting into when I started out to be an artist, especially to be an actor, because you have to become fully human. I mean, the art is to bring life to characters who are people, and people are human. And I was not really interested in being a human among humans. I wanted to be special. I did not want to be in the swamp of human everyday heartbreak. Give me years of brutal rejection any day. Because once you get on stage, you're safe. Because you get the whole script in advance. And I really wanted to know what was going to happen before it happened, I also wanted to get my own way, and I didn't want to have to be myself to do it. Acting. On that front, I was as misguided as King Lear and Lady Macbeth. I mean, those two were so committed to creating their own reality, they could have just walked out of a Tony Robbins seminar, See, the problem is everyone else is also creating their own reality at the same time. And you are just a bit player in their play that's starring them, So as an actor, I'm always asking myself, about the character, like, what am I fighting for? What are you fighting for? That's a director. What are you fighting for? What lengths will you go to get it? So each character, I'm not talking to the actors, I'm talking to the scientists now. Each character has an overriding personal objective, right? And the other characters either aid you or they thwart you, and that conflict creates drama or comedy. So, say my character's objective is to find love. My character, not me. If I'm in a comedy, I will find love, but not with whom or how I expect to. If I'm in a drama, I won't. And if I'm a female in a misogynist culture, I'll most likely be killed or murdered in some violent, ugly way. Either way, I, the actor, will know how the story goes in advance, so I can prepare for what's coming. Like if I'm a method actor, I might use the details of a specific moment from my own life to reach the emotions that are called for in a scene. Like in a movie, you do the same scene again and again. So I'm thinking of the same sad moment, and after 20 takes of heavy sobbing, I often start to feel real sadness. But, then we wrap, and I get in my car, and I drive home, and I have a cheese sandwich, and I return my phone calls. That is so not possible when the real thing actually happens. Like, when I was first married, and I was so in love, that I believed to my core that our bond was unbreakable. And then one day, we were just sitting in a parked car on Lake Street, and he said he didn't love me anymore. And maybe he never really had. And for some reason, I heard the sound of Velcro ripping open. I mean, it was deafeningly loud as he just tore open my chest, sliced out my heart, and got out of the car. And then I just sat there, staring out the window at this yellow awning over a bakery. Au bon pain. I swear to God, that was the bakery. Garcia Lorca wrote what I took as my artistic manifesto. And he said, the poem, the song, the picture is only water drawn from the well of the people and should be given back to them in a cup of beauty. So in drinking, they know themselves. So the shock of the real, when it happens, doesn't come in a cup. When the doctor finds a lump at your routine checkup, when an SUV swerves right into you going 75 miles an hour, when your baby's born 10 weeks early and it's 1.5 pounds and it dies that night in an incubator, there's no cup. There's nothing. There's this void. And what makes it possible for us as humans, once we know the random, heartbreaking terror of the uncertainty of life? I mean, how can we still laugh once we know how cruel it is? And then I thought, only a suicide has absolute certainty that for them there is no hope. What relentless force does that weak word represent? There's so many poems about it. Hope springs eternal. Where there's life, there's hope. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. See, I think that my old fear of feeling fully human was this fear of really falling for it. Hope. You know, that the whistle in the dark, the watery tinkle of remote possibilities was actually the overture to another crushing disappointment, which of course it has been, but not every time. So tonight, anyway, I wonder if hope is the unfathomable soul music that is the seed of every artistic impulse, and possibly even the unnameable substance of the endlessly recombinant creative universe. It's the first thing you hear in the morning. It's the last thing you hear at night. In the woods, in the swamps, in the old steeple, in the ruined eaves over the wreckage of the car your mother drove straight into a wall. The bird won't stop singing. It's perched in the ashes of a house that burned to the ground. Wherever you move, it's one hop ahead of you, tireless as a creek. It's a tune that will not allow itself to be forgotten. It keeps building and leaving its nest, all chatter, all expectation, water, singing to itself in the shadows as well as in the sunlight. That insufferable optimist. No matter how many doors you slam, curses you shout, rocks you throw, it pipes up louder than ever on this very branch of this very tree outside your house, as if stones were your way of applauding. It was singing the morning you got fired, the day you brought grief to the person you most wanted to protect, the evening that great cause you pledged yourself to failed. It sang while your father was writing his suicide note, the night your dear friend told you her cancer came back and it spread, the night you could find nothing remaining to believe in, when all you wanted was to be left alone. It sings in places so dark you can't see into them. It's out there. It's out there singing now. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to bring up my co-patriot bohemians. Danny Frankel is going to play the drums, bongos, and Hal, where's Hal? Hal Wilner is a record producer, a really good, dear friend, who has done everything from the score to Talladega Nights to this great record that's out right now called Rogues Gallery that Johnny Depp executive produced, and it's pirate sea shanties with everyone from Anthony to Keith Richards. And we've also done 4-hour marathon readings of the entire works of Marquis de Sade with Sting and Stanley Tucci and Diamond de Gallis. And we just thought this would be fun.
In order to demonstrate the uncertainty of human communication, we will perform the classic comic routine, who's on first, done in the vernacular of the hip. Take me out to the ball game. Hey, Dig, I took a gig managing a B minor baseball team.
Oh, I love baseball. You got to tell the guys' names on the team. So when I go to the ballpark, I will know those fellows.
Cool. But check it out. These days, they give these ball players some very crazy names.
Crazy names?
Nicknames, pet names. Now we have who's on first, what's on second, I don't know is on third.
So that's what I want to find out. I want you to tell me the names of the fellows on the team.
I'm telling you, who's on first, what's on second, I don't know is on third.
Hey, you know the names of the fellas on the team?
Yes.
All right, then who's playing first?
Yes.
I mean the fella's name on first base.
Who?
The cat playing first base.
Who?
The guy on first base.
Who is on first?
Well, what are you asking me for?
I'm not asking you. I'm telling you, who is on first?
No, I'm asking you. Who's on first?
That's the man's name.
That's whose name?
Yes.
Well, go ahead and tell me.
Who?
The guy on first.
Who?
The first baseman.
Who is on first?
Have you got a first baseman on first?
Certainly.
Then who's playing first?
Absolutely.
When you pay the first baseman every month, who gets the bread?
Every dollar of it. And why not? The cat's entitled to it.
Who is?
Yes.
So who gets it?
Why shouldn't he? Sometimes the lady comes down and collects it.
Who's old lady?
Yes. After all, the Dune earns it.
Who does?
Absolutely.
All I'm trying to find out is what's the guy's name on first base?
No. What is on second base?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
That's what I'm trying to find out.
Well, don't change the players around.
I'm not chasing nobody.
Cool it. Bad.
Hal, what's the guy's name on first base?
What's the guy's name on second base?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
I don't know!
He's on third. We're not talking about him.
Wait, how do we get to third base?
You mentioned his name.
Wait, if I mentioned his name, who did I say was playing third?
No, who's playing first?
Stay off of first, will ya?
Oh, man, what do you want me to do?
What's the fella's name on third base?
What's on second?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who is on first?
I don't know.
He's on third.
There we go, back on third again.
Well, I can't change their names.
Oh, will you please stay on third base?
Come on. What is it you want? You're bugging me. What is it you want to know?
The cat's name on third base.
What is the cat's name on second base?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
I don't know.
Third base.
You got outfield?
Sure.
You got a good outfield?
Absolutely.
All right, the left fielder's name.
Why?
I don't know. I just thought I'd ask.
Well, I just thought I'd tell you.
Then who's playing left field?
Who's playing first?
Stay out of the infield.
Don't mention any names out here.
I just want to know what is the cat's name in left field.
What is on second?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who is on first?
I don't know.
Third
base.
Take it easy, take it easy.
All right, it's the left fielder's name, man.
Why?
Because.
Oh, he's center field.
All right, wait a minute. You got a pitcher on the team?
Yeah, you gotta have a pitcher on the scene.
All right, right. Tell me the pitcher's name.
Tomorrow.
You don't want to tell me today?
I'm telling you, man.
All right, then go ahead.
Tomorrow.
What time?
What time what?
What time tomorrow? You're going to tell me who's pitching.
Now listen. Who is not pitching? Who is on...
If you say who's on first, I'm going to kill you. I just want to know, what's the pitcher's name?
What is on second?
I don't know.
Third base.
You got a catcher?
Yes.
All right, what's the catcher's name?
Today.
Today. And tomorrow's pitching.
You nailed it.
Oh, that's all. You got a couple of days on your team. That's all.
Well, I can't help that. What do you want me to do?
So you got a catcher?
Yes.
Hey, I'm a fine catcher too, you know.
I dig.
Yeah,
I'm aware of that.
I would like to play on your B-minus team.
Well, I might set that up.
Yeah, I would like to catch. Yeah. All right, I'm being a fine catcher. Tomorrow's pitching on the team, and I'm catching.
Yes.
All right, tomorrow throws the ball, and the guy up bunts the ball.
Yes.
All right, now when he bunts the ball, me being a good catcher, I want to throw the guy out at first base. So I pick up the ball, and I throw it to who?
Now, that's the first thing you said right.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Well, that's all you have to do.
Is throw it to first base.
Yes.
So who's got it?
Naturally.
Who has it?
Naturally.
Who has it?
Naturally.
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 Okay.
Now you've got it.
All right, I pick up the ball and I throw it to naturally.
No, you don't. You throw the ball to first base.
Yeah, then who gets it?
Naturally.
Okay.
All right.
I throw the ball to naturally.
No, you don't. You throw the ball to who?
Naturally.
Well, that's it. Say it that way.
That's what I said.
You did not.
I said I throw the ball to naturally.
You don't. You throw it to who?
Naturally.
Yes.
So I throw the ball to first base and naturally gets it.
No, you throw the ball to first base.
Then who gets it?
Naturally.
That's what I'm saying.
You're not saying that.
Yeah, I throw the ball to naturally.
You throw it to who?
Naturally.
Naturally. Well, say it that way.
That's what I'm saying.
Don't get excited. Don't get excited.
All right. I throw the ball to first base.
Then who gets it?
He better get it.
All right. All right. Don't get excited. Now, take it easy.
No, I'm going to throw the ball to first base. Whoever it is drops the ball. So the guy runs to second. Who picks up the ball and throws it to what? What throws it to? I don't know. Throws it back to tomorrow. A triple play.
Yeah, could be.
And then another guy gets up, and it's a long fly ball to because. Why? I don't know. He's on third, and I don't care.
What was that?
I said I don't care.
Yeah, that's our shortstop. Thank you.
Okay, well, I guess we're going to do some questions. We don't have a lot of time, but we'll bring everybody up. And if you set your questions over to the side on index cards, we'll take a few of them. Chloe? That was so wonderful. And Clifford?
I'm going to go so you don't feel lonely.
I think he's coming.
All right. Do we have Questions? Well, okay. I don't know what happened to our index cards.
Who's breathing?
I should point out, if it wasn't obvious, that Chloe wrote that bit especially for tonight. Not who's on first.
No, not who's on first.
but the beginning part of it. Well, I don't know. So let's just take some. Oh, here he comes. Oh, sorry, you didn't have a mic.
Oh, I get it. So we're supposed to ask you questions?
No, I'm going to. We have questions on index cards. Okay. Did people pass questions about religion as well? And maybe, if not, we'll just take some physics ones. Do you want me to choose, or would you like to choose from the?
I'm still dealing with the microphone.
Yeah, you can be me. Be me. I don't know physics answers.
No. No, I'm good.
Sure?
I think this one works.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well,
So what's the first one?
I'm going to just start with the first one that came up,
Okay.
because it works. Where does one draw the line between philosophy and science, and in your opinion, at which point does string theory lie?
That was really the
I
first
did not
one.
plan that.
I don't think there is a line between the two necessarily. After all, physics used to be known as natural philosophy, so there is a sense in which it is philosophy, but in the modern sense, which is probably what the questioner meant, one can spend an awful lot of time pondering the deep meaning of quantum mechanics and whether it's teaching us any deep philosophical lessons. And people do that and write papers and do all kinds of things, and it's a good thing to do. But then there's also the business of getting on describing nature and just doing what nature reveals to us, and just being pragmatic about it. So most physicists that I know spend some time thinking about the meaning of quantum mechanics and whether the moon is there when you don't look at it and all of those things, and then they get on with describing the world. And that's all there is to it, sorry to say. Where does string theory lie? Is it physics? Is it philosophy? We don't know, because it's like any scientific endeavor. You spend some time constructing a framework and a theory, and then you test it. And no matter how elegant and beautiful that framework is, if it fails to describe nature, then it is no longer physics. And we don't know which string theory is yet, because it has not yet been tested. We're still developing it. So maybe one day it'll turn out to be a nice piece of philosophy and nothing to do with the real world. Or maybe one day it'll turn out to be describe some aspect of reality. And we just don't know yet.
Fits in with our uncertainty principle. There is a question, actually I looked at these, there were 3 questions that addressed more or less the same theme. And it was addressed as a physics question, but I think in a way it applies to both Jonathan and Chloe as well, so maybe it'd be a fun thing to throw out. The uncertainty principle, as not being able to measure position and momentum at the same time, is a physical metaphysical claim, but uncertainty, as lack of certainty, is an epistemological feature of people. How can you reconcile these two senses of uncertainty? Chloe?
Well, I would say that what makes characters seem real to me, what makes people seem fascinating, is the odd thing that is unlike everything else. You know, like a really anal retentive person that has one very messy part of their life. You know, and also I can't really reconcile this. But it's an odd truth that I need to say, is that most of the actors that I know that play horrible psychopath, child molesting, murderer, that group of character actors are the most gentle, lovely people. And many of the people who I've known who play the bold, heroic person are just evil. And I don't understand that.
John?
Well, the thought occurred to me when Clifford was speaking that there is a bright line we can draw, an absolute boundary between everything on one side, which is a matter of what you feel or you think or your philosophy or your religious beliefs, and another side of the line is what you know because you can observe it and prove it through repeatable experiment. And that's the scientific revolution. I once read about an ancient Greek philosopher, I believe it was Aristotle, who spent a great deal of time thinking great thoughts and writing them down, and held the belief that men and women had different numbers of teeth, that women had fewer teeth. And it was observed, I believe it was Aristotle, that he never bothered to open Mrs. Aristotle's mouth and count. And I have, personally, I mean, you might be able to tell it from the tenor of my remarks, I have no patience whatsoever with someone blowing hot air at me about what they believe. I would like to know what they know and why they know it. And that's where religion, that's the far reaches of religion and the beginning of science.
That worked out really well, and it nicely brings me to another question.
Actually, just wanted to say something. There's something interesting. If you actually read the early days of the development of quantum mechanics, the term the uncertainty principle came about, and very many people at the time immediately recognized that that's actually not a good name, because when it comes down to it, uncertainty implies really the wrong thing about what's going on with the physics. It's simply telling you that there's certain kinds of information that you cannot know, but that's not the same as it all getting very wishy-washy in some sense. And so Bohr and others, I think, tried to get it called the indeterminacy principle, which is just to say that there's certain things that cannot be determined, which is very different from saying that there's certain things which are uncertain. But it didn't catch on, unfortunately.
No, I'm really glad you brought that up. I hope this other mic, I was told the other one it wasn't working. Actually, one of my early mentors, Vicky Weisskopf at MIT, called it the principle of absolutism, because as he explained, if you had, if the atom were really like a solar system, then the planets could be any old place, just as the electrons could be any place around the nucleus of an atom. But because of quantum mechanics, because these electrons can only be in very specified orbits or clouds or whatever you want to call them, and because of that, we have all the properties of nature. Why the chairs are red and why sugar is sweet and why our voices sound the way they do, and absolutely everything is based on that certainty. So going from certainty, here's one also for all of us meaning you three. There are no journalism questions, so I'm off the hook. Psychic phenomena, the spirit world, the supernatural, are all popular now in popular entertainment. How much of that, is anything, has any validity, do you think? Well, we can start with
you did what the
Jonathan.
Well, it has validity in the sense that the statement is valid. It is very popular.
Very good.
Beyond that, I'm not sure what validity means, so I will punt the question.
There's a physicist for you. Chloe?
Well, I think it's interesting, given what you were saying, that there is, I know many people who have their own beliefs, their own spiritual beliefs, which would not be codified by any, known structure. They don't really have rights or whatever. And to a certain extent, it's based on what you said, their own observable experience. Do you know what I mean? That they,
Absolutely.
whatever. And as a really, really smart woman said to me, who has an unusual idea about God, but it's her own, and she doesn't put it on anyone else, that if she did go to the end of her whole life and find out that God wasn't real, the joke would still be on whoever, because she feels like she had a better life because of that. But so how can you prove that? I mean, how can I prove she's...
Well, if I may, one of the things I discovered in the research for my book on paganism is that one of the common features in pagan temples, something we never hear about, was a carved image of a human ear. And that's because people would come to the pagan temples for the same reason they go to churches and synagogues, because they were sick, or they were worried, or they were heartbroken, or they were needy, and they would whisper into this ear, and they believed they were whispering into the ear of the god, and the god would intervene and help them. That's a human impulse. A psychic phenomenon very commonly claimed by people who have lost a loved one. I mean, this is an old phenomenon, that they have a seance and they're convinced that they've spoken to their dead loved one, and it's a very powerful experience. I think it will surprise no one to hear me say it's not real, it's not happening, nobody from the other side is communicating, and there's no way to prove that. There's no repeatability to these psychic experiences, but it is part of the same impulse that I called earlier the religious imagination. It's the way the human mind projects itself onto the real world and tries to find meaning and comfort.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because one of the dualisms that really drives me nuts is the idea that people who are interested in science and scientific are not, quote unquote, spiritual. There are a couple of wonderful books that address this. There's a new one by E.O. Wilson, who some of you may know. He's already won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and is just a wonderful guy. And this book is addressed to Dear Preacher, to evangelical Christians. And the argument he's making is that the creation, that's the title of the book, the creation, is such a wondrous and marvelous thing that it really doesn't matter if you think it came into being 6,000 years ago or through billions of years of evolution. We have much more in common than we think. And those feelings of awe and wonder at the universe are very similar to the feelings people get through religion as well. So there certainly are differences, but we can, and I think should, try to find common ground, which is the point of this series. I was told I should not keep you away from cookies, so I'm going to invite everybody to come back on November 16th, when we will be exploring more uncertainty. If you want to know anything further about these programs, you can email me or go on the Visions and Voices website. Also, they have information about all the programs. And
what's the name of his blog again?
Oh,
I want to go on.
yeah.
Still on. Chloe just reminded me that we didn't really take much in the way of questions, etc. But we can continue this conversation by going to the blog. So that's asymptotia, which I will not attempt to spell, but if you, I don't know, Google my name or something, you'll find it eventually. And we can just continue chatting, and you can also chat with each other through the comments, and we can have fun.
And right now we'll go continue the conversation upstairs with cookies. Thank you.